Good morning everyone and welcome to the online edition of the Compliance Officers Conference for 2022. I'm here in Birmingham for the face-to-face event and it is frankly wonderful again to see so many solicitors here, even if this time we've been impeded by train strikes rather than COVID. There always seems to be a reason why some people can't get here, yet so many have and I know are really enjoying the opportunity to meet with us and meet with each other. A big theme of the conversations that we're having here is change. And I suppose the fundamental message that change is a constant. Who would have thought this time last year that we would now be talking about a war right on our doorstep in Ukraine, a terrible event but with global consequences for all of us and actually quite significant consequences for us in the legal profession. And it's not just that we're facing. Having dealt with COVID, I hope, we are now moving on to some very significant economic issues and a very big cost of living challenge. And if there's one message from all of that, it is to say that we all need to be nimble, agile and responsive to the events that are happening around us. Of course, one of the big changes that happened, partly as a consequence of COVID, was that we discovered that some of us, of course, like to be in the room and have these conversations face to face, but we can reach so many more people by offering the opportunity to engage in a virtual conference. And that's why we are again this year providing you with an online edition. During the course of this week, we have no less than 11 different sessions covering everything from cybercrime through money laundering to continuing competence. And at each of these sessions, you will have the opportunity to hear in a recorded version what happened at the conference. And in many, you will then have a live opportunity to ask your own questions to a panel of experts. When we were here in Birmingham, myself and our Chief Executive, Paul Phillip, recorded a session on the challenges that we're facing as a regulator and the challenges for the sector in an interviewed discussion with Clive Myrie, which I hope you'll also find valuable. So I just want to say thank you again for joining us for the online edition. Maybe some of you will be able to see in person next year, but I know this suits many of you better. So please let us know what you think. Once you've taken advantage of these sessions. We look forward to interacting with you following this conference. Thank you very much.
Good morning and welcome to the Virtual Compliance Conference 2022. Welcome in particular to this session on complying with sanctions and financial crime regulations. Sorry for the slight delay in kicking off this morning, but hopefully will be worth the wait. So as Anna said, it was lovely to see so many people in the room at the compliance conference last week, but lovely to see so many people online. So the way this is going to work is that we'll see a recording from the presentation from our session at the live conference last week. But we do want today's session to be as interactive as possible. I know there was lots of people that didn't get a chance to ask a question on the day. So after the video has played, which will be about 40 minutes, we'll have time for questions and answers, and we'll have about 20 minutes to take your live questions. So to ask a question, what you need to do is just click on the link below this broadcast and submit your question. It's great to know your name if you're happy to share it, but you can submit a question anonymously if you'd rather not give your name. So I'll be speaking to you again in around 40 minutes, but first on to the recording.
Now, I am the BBC's chief correspondent as well as a presenter. And over the last 30 years or so, I've reported from all over the world, from Asia to the Middle East, the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And I've seen how repressive regimes and authoritarian rulers can stifle humanity. As we've already mentioned today, I've seen up close the results of the war in Ukraine, an illegal invasion under international law, an unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation. Now, that war might be far away, but adhering to sanctions isn't simply a theoretical bureaucratic exercise. Following the law, agreed within an established legitimate framework, can have significant human and political effects and may even help bring an end to hostilities and end the bloodshed. So our final session of the day is about complying with sanctions and financial crime regulations. And I'm joined by Collette Best, who leads on Anti Money-Laundering at the SRA. Suzie Ogilvie is a global head of financial crime and sanctions at Freshfields Bruckhaus Deringer, and Giles Thomas is director at the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation, the OFSI, and Economic Crime, which is part of the Treasury. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. Now, there will be time for questions near the end, so please submit them through the app if you like, and you can do it anonymously, so there's no problem there. Or, of course, you can raise your hand towards the end here in the audience, and we have people with microphones that can get to you. And please keep your questions short and to the point if you can, and give us your name and where you're from. That would help us very much indeed. Now, let's hear the SRA perspective on all of this from Collette Best.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you very much to all of you for staying for this final session of the conference, in particular those who've already been to one anti-money-laundering session this morning. So Clive has spoken a little bit about why this matters in the international context. I'd like to just speak a little bit to kick us off about the UK context, because I think particularly at the moment the onslaught of legislation, of change, can feel completely relentless. We've had, 4 or 5 sets of new regulations in as many years. So I think it's really important to remind ourselves why this matters and why it's so important. So I'd strongly recommend taking a look at the NCA assessment of strategic and organised crime. And what it really does drive home is that money laundering is absolutely not a victimless crime. So over £12 billion of criminal cash is generated in the UK, and that's every year. So it's a staggering amount of money that criminals are seeking to launder through firms just like yours. And there are a lot of criminals trying to do this. So the NCA estimate that there's over 70,000 known serious to organised criminals operating in the UK. And in terms of how the threat is changing, the NCA is seeing a real increase in bribery and corruption and sanctions evasion, but also crimes such as child sexual abuse, cybercrime, drugs trafficking, fraud, and money laundering. And so actually for me, one of the most depressing statistics is around the harm to vulnerable adults and children that are caused by acquisitive crime. And the increase of child abuse during lockdown has been absolutely staggering. And the NCA says that's in the region of 700 individuals posing risk to children operating in the UK. And this is a money-generating activity, which again, criminals are seeking to launder the profits of which through your firms. In terms of drugs, another massive scourge to society. There's a combined annual cost to society, and that ranges from things from tackling supply to providing treatment of over £19 billion. The latest figures available suggest that there were nearly 3,000 drug-related deaths in England and Wales and 1,200 in Scotland in 2019. So it's a really important issue. It's really important to remind ourselves why this matters and why you're trying so hard to tackle this. So what did we at the SRA do to try and prevent firms from being used for laundering money? Well, this continues to be a key risk for the SRA. And as you heard Paul and Anna say first thing this morning, our real preferred methodology is to provide tools for the firms to help them try and prevent and to comply with the money laundering regulations. So our first line of defence is publishing guidance, and that is designed to be helpful to you. We also undertake proactive supervision, and we also undertake enforcement activities where we see significant or widespread issues. And all of this is covered by our annual report, which was published a couple of weeks back. I'd strongly recommend you download that. It's got lots of case studies, it's got lots of information about where firms are struggling, and some areas where actually we're beginning to see some improvements. But just to give you the highlights from that report. So in the last year, we have published extensive guidance, which is well worth familiarising yourself with. So along with the other legal supervisors, we've published LSAG guidance, that's a Legal Sector Affinity Group guidance, which has been approved by Treasury. And that has also been revised to include information about the 2022 regulations, which is currently awaiting approval. But that will be a really good read when that comes out, because it contains lots of information about the changes to, for example, proliferation financing risk assessments, which you'll need to be aware of. We've also published guidance, which I'm sure you'll be very interested in, specifically for money laundering reporting officers and money laundering compliance officers, and that's designed to help you help your firm comply with the regulations. There's lots of guidance on who the regulations apply to, who's in scope, who's out of scope, and there's also lots of helpful webinars online, so do please check out the resources that we put up there. They're designed to be helpful, and if you think there are gaps, if you think there's bits that aren't quite clear, do please get in touch, because we are looking to increase that resourcing. So that's sort of the first line of defence. Our second prong is proactive supervision. So in the last year, the numbers of firms that had some form of proactive supervision from us increased, and you can expect to see a further increase in the year ahead. But in the last year, 273 firms received either an inspection or a desk-based review. And that was 126 rolling inspections, 13 forensic investigations, 25 as part of a thematic review, and 109 desk-based reviews. And what that's showing is that we are seeing improvements in a lot of areas, particularly in firm-wide risk assessments, but actually there are areas that firms are still continuing to struggle with. In particular, assessing risk at client and matter level, doing identification and verification, and also policies, procedures and controls, which leads me on to the enforcement side. So in the last year, we had 252 reports of suspected breaches, and often these are around failures to do customer due diligence, failure to do source of funds checks, or failure to have a firm-wide risk assessment. And there has been a steady increase in enforcement outcomes. One thing to bear in mind is, and if you read the report, all of this is detailed in it, but a key theme from those enforcement outcomes is actually a lot of them could have been avoided through really thorough training and supervision of fee earners. But as Paul said this morning, we do have increased fining powers. You can expect to see enforcement increase in this area. So let me just say a word or two about suspicious activity reports, because this is a really important area, and it's an area where criticism is often levied at the profession that suspicious activity reports are of a poor quality. So in the last year, we have, when we've been out on site doing inspections, been looking at the quality of suspicious activity reports that have been submitted. And actually, what we found is that the SARs that we've reviewed, the suspicious activity reports that we've reviewed, are written in generally a clear and comprehensible manner. They refer clearly to the proceeds of crime involved, and they clearly describe the transaction involved. there's maybe 3 really key things and really tangible ways that you can improve the suspicious activity reports that you're submitting. So where we found room for improvement, we found that the most consistent finding was that 2/3 of firms are not including glossary codes when they submit suspicious activity reports. And these are really helpful for the NCA to triage and to sort suspicious activity reports. So do make sure you're looking up glossary codes, which are available on the NCA website, they're available on our website, and including them in your suspicious activity reports when you submit them. The second point that we found is that around a quarter of Defence Against Money Laundering suspicious activity reports did not name the criminal act for which the firm was seeking permission to go ahead with. So it will save you a lot of time, it will save the NCA a lot of time if you're absolutely explicit on the criminal act for which you're seeking consent. And then finally, in around 1 in 4 suspicious activity reports that we reviewed, firms were not including the details of their client or individuals. So the NCA find client emails and phone numbers really helpful. And absolutely, you may not have those, but if you don't, just specify that in the body of the suspicious activity report. So there's lots of information and guidance on how to submit a suspicious activity report. Hopefully you managed to check out the lunchtime session by the NCA. We also in 2021 did a webinar with the NCA on submitting good quality suspicious activity reports. That's available online and is well worth a watch for MLROs. So finally, let me say a word or two about sanctions before I hand over to Suzie to speak a bit more about practical tips for complying with the regime. So I think the most important point to make is that the money laundering regulations apply to approximately 2/3 of firms that we supervise. They apply to transactions that could potentially be used to launder money. Financial sanctions obligations apply to everyone. They apply to all firms and all areas of work. So it's something that you absolutely need to make sure that you're getting right. And again, unlike the risk-based approach in anti-money laundering, the sanctions regime is a strict liability regime. So the regulations don't set out the way of preventing breaches. It just sets out that you must not do certain things. So that really means that you need to know who you're doing business with to avoid sanctions breaches. Not just the client in front of you, but any beneficial owners and also the counterparties. So we'll shortly be publishing guidance on financial sanctions, which is designed to help you firstly understand the regime and the licensing, but also where the real risks lie, what are red flags of financial sanctions, and also what would be a sensible set of policies, procedures, and controls to put in place to make sure that you're staying on the right side of the law. The other thing to be aware of is that this is an area that we are going to be more intrusive in the next year. We've already done a bit of work in this area, so we've already done a thematic review, which, as I say, the results of which and the guidance will be published very shortly. We've also done an exercise to call in some firms' client lists and to screen those against the financial sanctions listing. But actually in the coming year, what we'll start doing is a more extensive, proactive program of checks around financial sanctions. And as I said, that will be firms not just in scope of the money laundering regulations, but across the board. So now is the time to make sure that you put your house in order, that you do have good policies in place, that you are identifying clients, and really importantly, that those people in the firm who might have contact with designated persons know what your procedures are, that they're trained correctly. So I think that's my time up, but with that in mind, I will hand over to Suzie, who's going to talk a little bit about some practical tips to help you comply with the financial sanctions regime.
Thank you, Collette. So, sanctions, challenges, and bear traps. If I was to cover everything in this topic, we would be here for perhaps going on 3 or 4 hours. So, I'm not going to do that, you'll be pleased to hear, but I will focus on some of the key challenges that are presented by sanctions, and maybe give you some hints and tips as to how to actually deal with them. I'm not going to give you a checklist that will make everything right, and unfortunately this is not a case of collecting in pieces of paper or documents. There's going to have to be, unfortunately, with some of these questions, a bit of investigation and a bit of thought and a bit of you applying your mind to say, do I feel comfortable? And that is really the sort of environment in which you're operating. Some of the challenges, well, the biggest challenge I would say in this area is the speed of change in sanctions. When you have money laundering legislation, it goes through iterations and so on and so forth, and you can start to see what is coming in the pipeline. Sanctions are not like that, and you have to be able to react swiftly to them. Not only that, every single regime seems to be different. So it's the speed of change, and it's also a multitude of differences across various sanctions regimes, and that can make it incredibly challenging. The other thing, and a very, very important point, and I'm sure you have worked out this by now, given that we've had a significant increase in sanctions over the last however many months, that this is not just about checking sanctions lists. You actually need to look at ownership and control, so that's why Collette is talking about beneficial owners, for example. And you also need to consider what I refer to as sectoral sanctions or trade sanctions. So this isn't just about checking parties. You've got to understand the matter on which you're acting and whether or not that could, of itself, trigger any sanctions breaches. Now, first of all, ownership and control. There are obviously question marks over the level of due diligence that are required. And bearing in mind, as Colette's pointed out, this might actually apply to counterparties on the transaction. There's a certain amount of thought that's going to have to go into this process, and you're going to have to think about the circumstances in which you might look more closely at ownership and control of counterparties, because it's not something that naturally falls within your client due diligence measures. Other challenges that we face are the circumvention risks and facilitation risks. There was a recent red alert that was issued in relation to circumvention, and there was a lot of material in there as to what the risks are, and a focus on doing the right level of due diligence to make sure that you're not caught out with circumvention issues. Particular example that was in that red alert related to the divestment in shareholdings by designated persons, or DPs. Excuse me. As I've said, the sectoral sanctions, a thorough and ongoing analysis of the matters is needed. It's not just a gating issue when you're looking at a new matter. Things change during the course of the life cycle of a matter, and so you have to be aware of what is going on. And also, going back to that first point that I made, if it is something that is lasting for several weeks, you need to be aware of new sanctions that could impact an existing matter as well. And finally, as if the UK sanctions weren't enough for us all, there is the US secondary sanctions. And whilst this might not be an area of focus for the SRA, it is not something that you should ignore. And the reason being is these US secondary sanctions are extraterritorial in nature. If you find yourself breaching these extraterritorial sanctions, the next thing that could happen is you receive a letter asking you to stop what you're doing, and if you don't, you might find yourself on a US sanctions list yourself. Now, I'm sure that's not something that you want to consider. The reason being is as soon as you end up on a US sanctions list, no financial institution will touch you. So, very, very important to be aware of those US sanctions as well. So, I've probably scared you a little bit. So, I'm going to give you some hints and tips now and questions that you might ask. So, email alerts. If you haven't already signed up to the Treasury email alerts, make sure you do. It does help you to understand when new sanctions are issued. There are guidance notices. You can click on the links. It takes you directly to what has been issued, and then you can get a flavour of the new sanctions and what you need to do in order to comply. Not only HM Treasury alerts, please make sure, as I've said, US sanctions, sign up to the OFAC alerts. And make sure you understand what new sanctions are in the US. Now, not all will apply, and so it's worth looking at frequently asked questions on their website of OFAC, which is the US equivalent of OFSI. Make sure that you understand when they might apply. Look at the frequently asked questions. There's a lot of helpful information on there. In terms of other helpful tips, look at how your new business intake works in your firm and start to think about how you might actually capture those client and counterparty risks. Can you come up with some keywords as well as potentially having an ability to search the names in the system? Are you doing some general research on the internet, for example, as well, to understand whether perhaps a counterparty might have a designated person in the structure? Are you potentially using one of the providers that will actually produce sanction hits returns? Also, can you build in any keyword searches for the sectoral sanctions? So many years ago, when there were some pipeline sanctions that had been issued by the US, we built in that as a keyword into our searches. And so if it came up in the context of pipelines and Russia, then there was an alert on the system which triggered an extra review. All of these things are trying to, help you capture these risks. So it's about careful thought about what's coming out and what you can do with the systems that you have. I do understand that everybody's is different, so you will have to tailor your approach. In terms of ownership and control and doing your due diligence, for example, well, the first place to start really is to understand whether your proposed client or a counterparty is a designated person, but then look at the shareholding structure. People often focus on that 50% rule in terms of ownership, but don't forget that control has a much, much wider meaning, a much wider definition. That fourth limb that is in the legislation captures situations where it is reasonable to conclude that a designated person might, if they wish to, essentially direct the affairs in whole or in substantial amounts of the entity that you're looking at. So do be aware of that limb. And that is a particular challenge because there's no sort of exact percentage that you can look at to rule something out. In terms of looking at percentages, even if it's less than 50%, what is their influence? Are there any other relationships with other shareholders, for example? That might actually involve a bit of internet research into, perhaps business relationships that individual might have. And then you have to consider, well, could there be some control through that party because they've been closely associated in business for years? These are things to think about in terms of your risk. Also, reduction in shareholdings in response to sanctions. A number of the people who were designated thought they anticipated their designation, and they took the opportunity to transfer their shareholdings to other parties, some of whom were family members, and some of whom were also close associates. Look carefully at that as well. So you might not be looking at the current situation, you might be looking at something that's happened recently. Another trap for you is it's not just about where are you today, it might be what actually happened around the time that they were designated. The other issue that you need to be looking at is secrecy countries. If there are countries who hide beneficial ownership or where it is easier to hide beneficial ownership, that is also a watch out for you and for you to consider carefully whether or not you have the comfort levels in terms of ownership and control. Other things that are watch outs, you might get an assurance from a party that they're not sanctioned, please do carefully look at any assumptions in there. Please look at where that has come from. Other things to look at as well, any other forms of control. We had a situation that I was looking at where, in fact, there was a rather bizarre share pledge had been issued in return for financing, and that share pledge gave current rights to a designated person to exercise control. It's a very unusual provision for that share pledge, and we were pleased to have been able to have the opportunity to review those share pledges so that we could actually manage our risk. Think about transfers of financial obligations in favour of Russian persons and Russian-linked persons. There's another watch out in making sure that you're complying with sanctions. In terms of newly incorporated companies, so perhaps a newly incorporated company has come to you, it's in a low-risk jurisdiction, there's an individual sitting behind it. What do you know about them? This is where your client due diligence comes into, helping you make sure that you're not in breach of sanctions and that you're tackling the appropriate circumvention risks. Because if you don't know who these people are or how they have actually accumulated the wealth or started up this company, how do you know that there's not a designated person sitting behind them directing the show? These are questions that are relevant for money laundering, but also relevant for sanctions compliance. My final watch out for you is thinking about the sanctions reporting obligations and also the money laundering reporting obligations. Don't forget, when you're looking at sanctions, you still have to think about whether there's a money laundering issue as well. And don't forget that there are actually sanctions reporting obligations, and I'm sure that Giles, the next guest, may be touching on that as part of his presentation. Thank you very much.
Suzie, thank you for that. Some really good practical advice on the sanctions front, and Collette as well. Thank you for that overview on money laundering. Now, let's turn to Giles. Just to repeat, Director at the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation and Economic Crime, which is part of the Treasury. Giles, it's good to see you. First of all, how has the Russian invasion of Ukraine changed the overall sanctions landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a truism to say it has generally been unprecedented in terms of the size, the scale, the complexity and the level of international coordination that we've seen with these sanctions. Previous extensive sanctions regimes on countries such as, Egypt, Libya, Iran, DPRK, these are countries that are relatively smaller than Russia and where the economic ties are much less. Russia's a G20 country, so I think we've seen, an explosion in new sanctions listings. I think about 1,200 new listings on the consolidated sanctions list, most of them in a very short period at the start of the invasion. As Collette and Suzie mentioned, it's not just been a case of putting new names on the sanctions list. We've also brought in quite extensive sectoral sanctions, trade sanctions, and some quite novel sanctions. For instance, on the Russian central bank and their management of foreign currency reserves. And I think also, because of those economic ties and the scope of the sanctions, the complexity for business to implement them involved in these sanctions is much greater than with other regimes. And finally, Suzie mentioned OFAC and the US regime that you need to be mindful of. These are all sanctions we've done in coordination, by and large, with the US, the European Union, other partners, which maximises their impact. And we've tried our best to make sure that we're joined up and coordinated with our international partners. But, you also need to manage the potential complexity of different regimes that aren't aligned in every way. So, yeah, I think it genuinely is a really unprecedented and historic set of sanctions that we've currently got.
Sure. So what are the biggest recent changes then for businesses as regards sanctions?
Yeah, so I think, and a couple of the other speakers have mentioned these. I think, Firstly, it's the sheer volume, and businesses need to deal with suddenly hundreds of new names on sanction screening tools, and we've seen that for larger firms in particular. That generates big backlogs of alerts that they have to triage, that MLROs need to wade through, and where you think you may have breached sanctions or where you think you may be dealing with a designated person, you need to report that as soon as you can to OFSI, or where there's a suspicion of money laundering, also to the National Crime Agency. So volume of work. I think it was perhaps Collette who mentioned the new enforcement approach that OFSI's adopted called strict liability, which you need to consider. So previously, in order to take enforcement action against a firm for breaching sanctions, we had to demonstrate that they knew they were breaching sanctions, or they had reasonable cause to suspect they were breaching sanctions. Now we've moved to a US model whereby there's strict liability, and we've put guidance around that, and it's not to scare people. We're not changing our approach. We're not out to catch people out. If you have proper systems and controls and you do your due diligence to the right standard for your business and your level of risk, we will take a proportionate approach, but it does put an additional onus on you in that regard. And I think Suzie talked a lot about the other big change I would highlight, which is just around ownership and control. And corporate transparency in Russia is notoriously opaque and difficult to get to the bottom of. We've sanctioned a lot of oligarchs, state-owned enterprises and other entities with tentacles in all different parts of the economy and the UK economy as well. So, you really need to look at your exposure both to your clients, your counterparties, as Collette and Suzie have said, and really risk assess your exposure to Russia business across the board, across all these different areas where we've put new sanctions in place.
I mean, is there anything law firms can do to speed up their license applications, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say at the outset, we recognise and acknowledge that a lot of firms who have put in licence applications are experiencing delays in getting those back. I mean, we've had, I forget the exact figure, but it's a 20-fold increase in number of licence applications over the last few weeks and months, and we're scaling up the resource in my team to deal with those. In the meantime, we're having to prioritise cases that are the most pressing, so humanitarian grounds where someone's lives at stake. If there's an economic impact, a wide-ranging economic impact, if someone's basic human rights, basic needs are being impacted. So if you think that is the case, do be very clear in your application to us. So that's first point. Second point, I would say, is try and give us as much information as possible up front to avoid us having to come back asking for more and more. Thirdly, with apologies for asking, but make it as clear and simple as possible. I've got a fantastic team of very willing and able people, but we're not experts in every sector that we're dealing with. So being clear about what's involved, the nature of the business. And then finally, please try and avoid what we call speculative applications. We've had a large number of people saying, well, I don't think I need a license for this. I think it's fine, but I want to put one in anyway, so you can tell me it is fine. And that just consumes time and effort and resource for us to wait. So I think, if you've got your own legal advice or you're certain it's legal, that's your decision, that's fine, but don't sort of ask OFSI to second guess that for you.
Sure. Is there an average time for a license application, or is that impossible?
There isn't, because it really just depends. I mean, some we can turn around in a matter of days, some take weeks or even months because they're incredibly complex, and it depends on the scenarios.
And what about the recent publication of a legal fees general license by your office?
Yes.
How does that help?
So this is something we've done to try and, as a rule across the Russia regime, we've put in over 30 general licenses now to help business. So general licenses are, instead of you as an individual firm having to specifically apply to OFSI to do a particular sort of business, where that business is named in the legislation as a potential area where you can apply for license. A general license just permits you to crack on and do that, provided it meets the terms of the general license. Sometimes, depending on the general license, you need to report that to Ofsted that you've used it. Sometimes you don't even need to do that. You just need to keep records for a number of years in case of audit or subsequent checks. And legal fees, we know, for you in particular, is a big concern. There's a large number of applications in our system where people are waiting for a response. So we've published this general license as a way of speeding that up, and where have a look at it. If you're doing business with a designated person under the Russia or the Belarus regimes, you can possibly use that for legal fees. It means that you don't need to put in a specific application. It's got certain limits around it, but provided you meet those, it will make your life and Ofsyd's life a lot easier.
Is there any more on the announced plans to restrict the ability of legal firms to provide services to anyone connected with Russia?
So that's something where we're currently consulting and working with the sector, and the final legislation, I think, will be published either later this year or early next year, and we'll put out further guidance. So I can't definitively say what the scope of that will be, and I know the SRA are very engaged in that work. I mean, what I would say is what we're not looking to do is cut off the provision of legal advice to designated persons seeking to challenge their designation, put in license requests, and so forth. This will be primarily aimed at commercial activities, so legal advice in relation to commercial activity in Russia, because the government's taken the view that, you know, given the scale and the severity of the crisis, you know, we want to actually restrict Russian commercial activity benefiting from UK legal expertise.
I mean, what are the expectations of the legal sector in combating sanctions evasion and cracking down on professional enablers who may be helping, I don't know, an oligarch or something evade a Russian sanction?
So, I mean, I think, first of all, please do take this seriously. It really matters. I think Clive said at the outset, you know, sanctions do matter. They can have an impact. We know they are having an impact on Russia, and that impact is growing over time, and that will only happen, and they'll only achieve their aim if they're being implemented effectively. And you all, as the private sector, are the front line of implementing these. We don't implement them. We check you comply with them. We provide guidance. We enforce where people are willfully ignoring them or trying to circumvent them. But they're only as good as the implementers, which is you all in practice. So, you know, do risk assess what you're exposed to. Do ensure that you're following all the steps that Collette and Suzie have highlighted. Do access all the products that we're putting out. You know, they've all been mentioned. NCA, Ofsted Red Alert with indicators and red flags of potential suspicious activity, particularly focused on the legal accountancy sectors. So that's really worth a read. Read the Ofsted guidance, read the upcoming SRA guidance, tune into our webinars and so on, and basically do help us make these sanctions continue to work.
Yeah, I mean, the war's been going on since February the 24th. I mean, have you come across any firms who have been involved in trying to break sanctions?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, I can't talk about individual cases, obviously, but we have got, and I know the National Crime Agency, who are responsible for criminal enforcement of sanctions breaches, as well as money laundering, have got a number of cases under active investigation. You know, enforcement cases take a while, a good few months, if not years, to come to light. But we know there are firms globally, but also in the UK, who they're the minority. The vast majority want to comply and are doing a fantastic job, for which we're hugely grateful. But there are a minority who I'd put in two buckets. You know, there's a very small minority who are, you know, actively, individuals and firms actively trying to help Russian designated persons avoid sanctions. And then there's perhaps a larger minority who are just negligent or not putting in place the necessary compliance systems.
Right, okay. And that's what this discussion is all about, to try and deal with a lot of that. Suzie, Giles and Collette, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, and welcome back from the video. So I'm really pleased to be joined with me today by Courtney Daniel, who is a Senior Sanctions Advisor from OFSI, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, and HM Treasury. Welcome, Courtney. All right, so we've had a few questions in online, and I'm going to kick off with a question to Courtney, because this one came in, I think, at 7:43 this morning, and the question didn't give their name. But this is a question about the new general fees license. So the question is, can the 500k general license fees recovery limit be used per client in a single matter where a firm is representing more than one client? So the question really is around whether that cap is per client or per matter.
Hi, thanks, Collette. Yes, so that the £500,000 fee is per designated person. So in a case like this, we would expect the total fees incurred to be apportioned to each client, and the recovery limit would then apply to each client. So the onus is then on legal fees to ensure that each of its clients has sufficient funds available in unused fees to remain under the cap. I hope that makes sense.
That's super. Thanks very much, Courtney. So a few more coming in. This one I'll pick up. It's more on the anti-money-laundering side, which is, when will we get formal guidance on the treatment of Chinese funds used in UK property purchase matters? So I know this is a really hot topic at the moment. We do have guidance being prepared in this area on behalf of the whole of the legal sector via the Legal Services Affinity Group. So that guidance is out, should be out fairly shortly. And actually it relates to all matters where there are currency controls in place. It's not specific to funds from China, although it does talk mostly about that nation. So lots more questions come in. You can still ask your questions at the link below. This question came in earlier and it's an anonymous one. So the question is, does that mean that solicitors can no longer provide services to Russian clients? Do you want to comment on that first, Courtney, and then I can pick up?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is about the services ban, which Giles covered towards the end of his talk. So I know there's been quite a bit of stuff in the news about this, but we haven't actually laid the legislation yet, and it hasn't come into force. So while we're looking, and I think we're in consultation with the legal sector about what exactly that's going to cover and what it's going to look like. But I mean, we will always have the right for designated persons to seek legal redress to their situation and be able to challenge their designation.
Perfect. Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, so I think just to add on behalf of the SRA, obviously Courtney and Giles have covered off the general ban to Russians that we're expecting to come in maybe late this year, early next year. As both said, that relates predominantly to transactional services, not to advice. And actually there is no reason at the moment why you shouldn't provide legal advice to Russian clients, but do make sure that you know who you're dealing business with. Make sure that you're checking the sanctions lists, you're checking any counterparties that you're dealing with, you're checking beneficial owners, and if the work is in scope of the money laundering regulations, make sure that you're applying all the customary due diligence requirements that relate to that legislation. So lots more questions coming in on the sanctions side. So this one, someone's been brave enough to put their name to. So Apan is asking, is the obligation to look into counterparties one that requires us to actively investigate all counterparties to a transaction, or is it an obligation to investigate only if something is worrying you about the situation or something worrying comes to our attention? Shall I come to you first with that one, Courtney, and I'll come in?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So I think, as always, there isn't a set set prescriptions that we can give you of what you have to do. But I think, as always, you need to take a risk-based approach. You need to look at what your business is, what the specific transaction is, how likely it is that it's going to be touching some sort of aspect of sanctions. But the onus is on you to kind of consider that. And I would say it's quite good to look down your payment chain and think whether there is potentially sanctions further down the chain rather than just your direct client. Consider any ownership and control structures, which I think Suzie talks about quite extensively in the video. And Collette, over to you for a bit more on that.
I'm not sure there's much more I can add to that, actually. So I think that's a really helpful answer. And I guess the only thing I would add is do bear in mind the strict liability nature of this regime. So if you are found to be doing business with a counterparty that is sanctioned, you are potentially subject to regulatory action. So do bear that in mind. I'd also flag that we are going to be publishing guidance fairly shortly on what our expectations in this area. So do watch out for further guidance in that area. So, all right, working down my list of questions. Adele has asked for a link to our supervisor's report. So I'm going to read out the link. It's quite lengthy, and I think we're going to include a link in the resources for this session. But the link is www.sra.org.uk/AML-research-publications/AML-2021-2022. So the easier way of getting to it is if you go to our website, click on the research and reports links, and it's there. It's the 2021-2022 annual report. So, but do please read that report. It's got lots of useful information about anti-money laundering, about sanctions, and about sort of areas where we're seeing enforcement action. All right, so carrying on down my list of questions. So Courtney, I think people will be looking at the general license, which has been issued for legal fees, which is in place for 6 months. Can you tell us whether you think that is likely to be extended, and I guess when the announcement will come as to whether it is being extended or not?
Yeah, so I think at the moment we're just kind of seeing how it's been used. So I think we're really welcome kind of any thoughts or any feedback on how law firms are finding it and how they're experiencing it. Are there parts of it that aren't working very well? Are there other things that we could consider? So I think the more evidence that we have from law firms as to the usefulness of the license will result in whether we extend it or not. So at the moment we haven't made a decision either way, but I think initially it feels like it's going to be helpful in getting rid of some of the backlog of the legal fees, specific license applications that we were dealing with.
Super, thanks Courtney. So another question that's come in online, again, this one is anonymous, similar to the one that was asked before. So are we able to act for Russian citizens who are not a designated person, not on a sanctions list in a conveyancing transaction? So why don't I comment on that first, and if there's anything that you want to add, Courtney, do chip in. So it looks like in this scenario, the solicitor has done their due diligence. They're clear that the person isn't a designated person, so they're not on the sanctions list. The thing that I would flag is that conveyancing work is in scope of the money laundering regulations. So you do need to make sure that you're doing your full customer due diligence under the money laundering regulations. Conveyancing typically considered high risk, so you're probably going to be wanting to look at source of funds, checking that you're happy with where the money is coming from. So all of those are factors that you'll want to consider. You'll also want to think about your firm's risk tolerance on taking on clients from potentially high risk areas. So do bear in mind that we do have these sort of parallel sets of regimes, which are both really important, both the money laundering regulations and the financial sanctions regulations. So do make sure that you're satisfying yourself that you've done all your customer due diligence in that scenario.
Yeah, nothing to add from my side on that, Collette. I think you covered everything off pretty nicely there.
Perfect. All right. So another question about licensing for legal firms. Courtney, are there any general hints or tips that you would give firms that are seeking licenses through OFSI?
So I think a lot of what Giles sort of mentioned in his talk is really relevant. So give us as much information as you can when you're applying for a specific license. Remember that we're not lawyers, so be as clear as you can. Imagine that you're talking to a 12-year-old. Explain exactly what you need, why you need it. Try and give us the more information you give us, the more quickly we can process that application, because we spend a lot of time having to go back and ask firms for more information, and that sort of takes a lot of time. Also, do consider whether there are any general licenses that you can apply for or that you can use that might mean that you don't need to apply for a specific license. And yeah, I mean, I think those are probably the two main things really to consider. But yeah, please just give us as much information as possible. And then I guess also the point that Giles made about speculative applications. So if you're not sure in terms of ownership and control, whether a company is owned or controlled, it's probably quite hard for OFSI to be able to give you that surety as well. So it's probably more helpful to take your own legal advice and decide whether you want to take, if you're not sure whether you want to take on that risk anyway, or whether you decide it would be better to de-risk and not conduct that business. And that's really a decision for you to make. Thanks.
Great point. Thanks, Courtney. All right, so we've got a couple more questions along the money laundering side, which I'll pick up. Evidently, COVID-19 led to a situation where firms are not meeting clients face to face, and as a result, it's inherently more difficult to identify and verify the identity of these clients. Can you tell us about some of the effective messages to be used for verifying client IDs in these circumstances? So I think that's a really helpful question. I think sort of pre-COVID, pre-2020, we would have thought that seeing clients, not meeting clients face to face is an inherent risk factor. I think post-COVID, it's something that happens much more frequently. So we've seen lots of great ways of firms making sure that they are mitigating the risk of not meeting clients face to face. I think technology has played a big part in this, and there are lots of great digital ID providers out there. If you are using a tech solution, if you're using electronic verification, do make sure that you understand your product really well, that you're doing your due diligence on the product, and that you're taking a questioning approach to the answers that you're getting through. So if you're getting a green tick from your electronic verification, that doesn't mean that that is a client that automatically you can take on. The chances are it means that you've had the identity of that client verified. So do still think about things like source of funds, source of wealth when necessary, if this client is within risk tolerance, and then sort of an ongoing basis, whether the risk is in line with what you would expect and the actions of the client are in line with what you would expect. We've also seen sort of lots of other slightly not lower tech, but not using specific systems. So people doing video calls with their client, asking them to hold up their passport, to zoom in, to sort of to show that they've got their ID with them in that way. So those are probably the top tips for acting for clients where you're not meeting them face to face. All right, and then another question, which is probably one for me. Does acting for Russian or sanctioned clients increase insurance premiums? So interesting question. I can't speak to whether the premium itself would be increased by acting for Russian individuals, or providing advice within a license for sanctioned persons, designated persons. If you are doing this type of work, if you're acting for designated persons, you do need to make sure that you are speaking with your insurers. Some insurers may exclude this work from cover. So you do need to make sure that you are speaking to your clients, you're making them aware of what the situation is, that you're absolutely clear with the insurer whether the work itself is covered. So that was another one sort of on the anti-money laundering side. We've got time for maybe another one or two questions. So an anonymous question here: can you refuse to act for a Russian client? So that's a good question. That is something that we have issued guidance from on behalf of the SRA towards the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. There is guidance available online on this. Typically, if you're taking on new clients, you can refuse to act for a Russian individual, but there is quite a bit of case law that covers this scenario. So do make sure that you're checking out our guidance on this. All right, and then another question on license applications. Courtney, if firms are wanting to put in license applications, is there someone at Ofsey that they can speak to get any advice or to ask questions about if they're not clear on the process or the forms that they're putting in?
So obviously has got well, we did have a helpline. I'm afraid we had to close down our helpline due to the sheer volume of calls we were getting, but there is an Ofsey email address, which is just ofsey@hmtreasury.gov.uk, that you can email with any questions, and people will try and get back to you, or they'll pass it on to a licensing caseworker. There's also quite a lot of information on our website, on our blog. So on the Ofsey website, on the gov.uk, if you I think it's ofsey.gov.uk, there's a whole section on how to apply for a license. So if you go in there, that tells you a few of the things that you need to do, and it's also got the license application form. We also wrote a couple of blogs around applying for licenses last year. So if you go on if you Google the Ofsey blog, they should come up. There's one about licensing itself and just about the basics of licensing, and then there was one about what reasonableness means within licensing. Some of the licensing, including legal fees, it says that it has to be reasonable within the legislation. So I mean, I think for legal fees, we generally take the Supreme Court guidelines as a starting place. So if you're applying for fees that are very different to what the guidelines are that the Supreme Court issues, then you need to tell us why. You know, there might be a perfectly good reason. It might be due to sort of the experience of the person sort of undertaking the work, but you just need to be quite explicit and show us why those fees are differing from what the norm for reasonable would be. But yeah, as I said, there is a blog on that. So I think the first port of call would be to look at what's available online, and after that, if your questions still aren't answered, if you get in touch with us via the email. Thanks.
Perfect, and really helpful to flag those useful resources that are available. So we've got time for maybe one more question, which is on the anti-money laundering side. So the question is, what is the last update of anti-money laundering rules and regulations, and how can it affect the practice? So the latest update of the AML, the anti-money laundering regulations, came into force in September this year. It's well worth making sure that you've had a read of those, because it did bring into force some changes. The two, I think, most important things to be aware of are the changes for discrepancy reporting at Companies House. That's now an ongoing obligation. There's also an obligation for you to assess your risk of proliferation financing. So that can either be a standalone document, which is a proliferation financing risk assessment, or it can be something that you work into your existing firm-wide risk assessment. And we, as part of the Legal Sector Affinity Group, LSAG, have got some updated guidance on this, which is just pending approval from Treasury. So that should hopefully be out reasonably soon. So I think that's pretty much all that we've got time for today. So thank you ever so much for watching. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. What we will do is we'll have a look at the questions that were posed, and we'll pick up and see if there's any future webinars that we can do on specific areas. And if you do have sort of specific case-based queries, then please give our ethics helpline a bell. They can offer lots of advice and support. So I think it's been a great session, but we do want to know what you think. Did this format work for you, and how could we improve it? So please do click on the feedback link below, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and please let us know your views. And this, of course, is the very first of the Cold Coffer sessions, which are all being screened this week. So you can visit the SRA events page for more information on those. And a bit of a plug, the second anti-money-laundering session will be taking place on Wednesday lunchtime. So if you've got specific questions on the anti-money-laundering regime and requirements, you can get those to us either anonymously or under your own name on Wednesday. So I think probably all that's left for me to do is to say a massive thank you to Courtney for joining me today and answering those questions so comprehensively, and to say thank you ever so much for everyone for joining, and we hope to see you very soon again, either virtually throughout the rest of the week or at a physical event. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.